come back.
I can hardly bring myself to recount the events I witnessed, but you must hear the truth. It weighs heavily on my soul, and I must confess it, for my heart aches with the burden of it all. I am a man of reason, a man of science, and yet what I have seen has shaken me to the core. It began with my friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll, a man of great intellect and kindness. Jekyll had always been held in high regard among our circle of friends and colleagues. We had known each other for many years, and I admired his work in medicine and chemistry. He was a man of duality, as most of us are, but I had no idea how deep those divisions ran. Dr. Jekyll, as I've come to realize, was a man struggling with a part of himself that he could neither accept nor understand. He had told me about his experiments, his attempts to separate the good from the evil within himself. I remember laughing at him, thinking it a foolish fantasy. But when I learned what he had truly done, I could not laugh any longer. It was late one night when I first encountered Mr. Edward Hyde. I had heard rumors of the man, of his terrible temper, his inexplicable fits of violence, and his strange appearance. People spoke of him with fear, and I admit, I was curious to meet him myself. Hyde was known to frequent a shabby building in the poorer part of town, a place I would never have ventured on my own. One evening, as I was passing by, I saw him. Hyde, the very man who had been the subject of our gossip for weeks. He was shorter than I had imagined, but the way he moved, the cruel twist of his smile, and the madness in his eyes made him seem far more menacing than his size suggested. He didn't even acknowledge my presence as I stood watching him, and I felt an involuntary shiver crawl down my spine. After that night, I began to see him more and more often. Hyde would appear on Jekyll's property at strange hours, sometimes even disappearing into the doctor's home at odd times. I confronted Jekyll about it, but he always dismissed my concerns, laughing it off as if Hyde were nothing more than a fleeting acquaintance, nothing to worry about. But I was not convinced. One evening, as I waited in Jekyll's study, I noticed something strange. A vial of strange liquid was sitting on the desk, dark and thick like molasses. Jekyll had been working on a new formula, he told me, something that would bring out the hidden aspects of human nature. He explained it with a sense of quiet pride, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. Later that night, I witnessed something I will never forget. It was after midnight when I was awoken by an unnerving sound, a violent crash, and then the unmistakable sound of laughter, but it wasn't Jekyll's voice. It was rough, jagged, full of malice. I rushed to the source of the noise, only to find the laboratory in disarray. The vial shattered on the floor, its contents spilled across the marble tiles. But the most shocking thing was what I saw next. Dr. Jekyll, my friend, was gone. In his place stood the creature I had met before, Hyde. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, and his eyes gleamed with something that resembled madness. The transformation was not subtle. It was as if the very essence of Jekyll had been ripped away, leaving only this vile, monstrous figure in his place. I could hardly comprehend what was happening. My friend, Dr. Jekyll, had vanished, and in his stead was this depraved individual who had terrorized the city. Hyde's appearance, his mannerisms, everything about him was a stark contrast to Jekyll's calm demeanor and intelligence. The very air around him seemed to grow heavy with the presence of evil. Hyde spoke to me in a cold, almost amused tone, explaining the nature of the transformation. He told me how Jekyll had created a potion, a chemical mixture that allowed him to transform into another person, someone without the moral constraints that Jekyll had spent his life adhering to. Hyde was the manifestation of Jekyll's darker desires, his unrestrained urges, freed from the bounds of his conscience. I was stunned. I could hardly believe what he was saying, but the evidence was clear. Hyde was the result of Jekyll's reckless ambition, and the transformation had made him into something entirely separate, an individual who reveled in violence and cruelty. I begged him to stop, to return to the man I had once known, but Hyde only laughed. "You don't understand, utter son," he said. "Jekyll is gone. There is no turning back now. I am free." In that moment, I knew that my friend, Dr. Jekyll, had become a prisoner of his own creation. He had sought to separate the good from the evil within him, and in doing so, he had unleashed a nightmare. I had no choice but to leave. Hyde disappeared again, and Jekyll returned to his normal self, but he was forever changed. The man I once knew was now a shell of himself, tormented by the very thing he had created. I could see the deep sorrow in his eyes, but it was mixed with something darker: fear, regret, and an undeniable longing for the release that Hyde gave him. Over the weeks that followed, I tried to help Jekyll, but every attempt to reach him seemed in vain. His battle with his darker self was a losing one. Eventually, he locked himself away in his laboratory, refusing to see anyone. I did not hear from him for days, and then, one morning, I received a letter from Jekyll's hand. In it, he confessed everything: his experiments, his transformation into Hyde, the horrors he had committed. He told me that he could no longer control Hyde, and that he feared the worst was yet to come. When I arrived at his home, I found the laboratory door locked from the inside. The sound of desperate movements came from within. With a heavy heart, I broke the door down, only to find a lifeless body of my dear friend, Dr. Jekyll. He had taken his own life, unable to bear the horrors Hyde had brought upon him. The letter he left behind was a final plea for forgiveness, a final confession of his tragic mistake. But it was too late. The man who had sought to unlock the secrets of the soul had, in the end, been undone by his own darkness. Now, as I recount these events, I wonder how many of us, deep down, are hiding our own monsters. How many of us would be willing to face the truth of what we are capable of if only we dare to look? I had been a young, ambitious solicitor when I was called to the small town of Crythin, Gifford, to settle the affairs of Mrs. Alice Drablow, a reclusive widow who had recently passed away. I had never heard of her before, but the instructions were clear. I was to go to her isolated home, Eel Marsh House, and take care of the legal matters left behind. I remember the drive there well. The road twisted through dense, fog-choked marshlands, the air thick and damp. The townsfolk, who barely acknowledged my presence, seemed uneasy. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes full of a quiet fear, and no one would offer much information about Mrs. Drablow or the house. I thought little of it at the time. After all, this was just a job, nothing more. When I arrived at Eel Marsh House, I found it to be even more unsettling than I had imagined. The house stood at the edge of the marsh, isolated and abandoned for years, with the sea breeze howling through the decaying walls. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Fisher, welcomed me, though I could see the thin veil of dread hanging over her like a storm cloud. The first night was uneventful. At least, that's what I told myself when I woke the next morning. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. I began to hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, a soft tapping on the window when there was no one outside. I brushed it off as my imagination, or perhaps the old house settling, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger each day. There were things in the corners of my vision, dark shadows that I couldn't quite focus on. On the second day, as I sat sorting through Mrs. Drablow's papers in the musty old study, something caught my attention. There was a photograph on the desk, an old, faded picture of a woman dressed in black. She was standing in front of the house, her face obscured by a veil. But there was something about her, something unsettling about the way she looked out from the photograph. I picked it up, feeling an inexplicable chill run down my spine as I stared into her eyes. Later that day, I made a trip to the local town hall to retrieve more records on Mrs. Drablow. I hoped to learn more about her life and maybe, just maybe, find an explanation for the strange occurrences at the house. But when I asked about her, the townspeople grew even quieter. No one wanted to talk about her, and they certainly didn't want to talk about Eel Marsh House. That night, I was determined to uncover the mystery. I had no choice. I had to finish my work. Mrs. Drablow's affairs were a mess, and I couldn't leave until everything was sorted. As the wind howled outside and the house creaked and groaned, I went through the papers in her desk. Then, in the back of a drawer, I found a letter that caught my eye. The letter was old, brittle with age, and signed by a man named Samuel Daly. It was a plea for help, a request for someone to come and help Mrs. Drablow, who had become increasingly erratic and paranoid. As I read the letter, a sinking feeling began to grow in my chest. Something had happened at Eel Marsh House, a tragedy, but the details were unclear. I spent the rest of the night reading through Mrs. Drablow's correspondence, hoping for answers. I was on edge, the air in the room thick with an oppressive weight. But then, just as I began to doze off, I heard it again, the soft tap, tap, tap against the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I leapt from the desk, rushing to the window. The curtains swayed in the wind, but there was no one outside. It was then that I saw her. In the reflection of the window, standing behind me, was a figure in black. A woman, tall and gaunt, her face hidden by a veil. My blood ran cold. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the emptiness of the house and the sound of my own breathing. I could no longer deny it. The house was haunted, and the woman in black was real. That night, I dreamed of her. In my dream, she stood at the edge of the marsh, her arms raised in a silent scream. Her eyes were full of sorrow and rage, and I could feel her pain pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The image of her burned into my mind. The next day, I went to the village again, hoping to find some answers. Samuel Daly, the man who had written the letter, was kind enough to speak with me. As he told me his story, the pieces began to fall into place. Mrs. Drablow had lost her child many years ago, and the woman in black, who had been her sister, had cursed the house, bringing with her an unholy presence that plagued anyone who entered. The townspeople, he explained, believed that the woman in black brought death with her. For years, the town had suffered tragedy after tragedy. Fires, drownings, suicides, whenever the woman appeared. No one had ever dared to speak of her openly, for fear of invoking her wrath. I returned to Eel Marsh House that night, determined to confront the woman in black and end this curse. But as the hours passed, I realized it was too late. The tragedy had already struck. The very thing I feared the most had come to pass. I never saw the woman in black again, but her presence lingers with me, even now, years later. Whenever the wind howls and the fog rolls in, I feel her cold, accusing gaze. And I know, deep down, that some mysteries should never be uncovered, that some curses are better left unbroken. Imagine a night, deep in the heart of winter, a quiet town, isolated from the world, where the wind howls through empty streets. But there's one house, always glowing from within, that no one dares to enter. Every night, a single light burns in the window, casting shadows on the snow-covered ground. No one remembers when it started. But now, people in the town speak in hushed tones about the guest who never leaves. David never believed in stories like this. He was a skeptic, always looking for answers in logic and reason. So, one night, he decided to visit that house. Nothing but a rumor, he muttered to himself. But as he approached the front door, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The light inside flickered once, then twice, and the door opened by itself. David hesitated at the threshold. The house seemed alive in some strange way, as if it was waiting for him. He stepped inside. The warmth of the air making him forget the freezing cold just outside. The door closed behind him, sealing him in. He could feel something watching him, someone, though no one was in sight. His breath quickened as the silence became unbearable. Then he heard it, a faint whisper like a breath on the back of his neck. "You shouldn't have come." David turned. Nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching ahead into darkness. He walked deeper into the house, feeling an odd weight in the air, as though the very walls were pressing in on him. Then, a door creaked open at the end of the hallway. Slowly, David moved towards it. When he stepped into the room, he saw the figure, a shadow sitting at the far corner of the room, barely illuminated by the dim light. It was himself, not a reflection, not a trick of the light, but his exact image, sitting in the chair, staring straight at him. "Who are you?" David whispered, his voice shaking. The figure didn't speak. It just smiled a wide, unsettling grin that made his blood run cold. David stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind him with an unnatural force. The room suddenly grew darker and the temperature dropped. His breath fogged in the air. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in around him. Suddenly, the figure moved. It stood, walking towards him, its footsteps slow and deliberate. David tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in his throat. The figure reached out, placing a cold, bony hand on his shoulder. And then, David's reflection in the mirror, standing just beside him, grinned. David turned to flee, but the house wouldn't let him. The door he had come through vanished. The walls bent, twisting like they were alive, as if the house itself were feeding on his fear. A muffled sound echoed from the corners of the room. Footsteps growing louder. From all sides. Suddenly, the figure spoke, its voice hollow, like it had been buried in the walls for years. "You are mine now." David could feel the floor beneath him tremble as the house began to shake, its groaning louder than any storm. The shadows around him moved, shifting like living creatures, reaching out for him. He ran, but no matter which way he turned, the walls would close and the hallways twisted. The house was reshaping itself, trapping him. Then, as if everything stopped, the house became still. David stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest, his breathing shallow. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. He turned to leave, but in the reflection of the broken mirror, there was something new. Another figure, standing right behind him. David spun around, but no one was there. The doors opened, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The last thing he felt was the cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him into the nothingness. And now, the house sits silently once again. The light in the window flickers as it always has, waiting for the next stranger, the next lost soul foolish enough to enter. And for David, there will be no escaping, because once you step into the house, you become part of its silent guest list. If you ever find yourself near this house, remember, there's always someone watching from the window, someone waiting. Would you dare to enter?